New Testament reading this morning is from the Gospel according to Mark, chapter 8, starting at verse 27. Jesus and his disciples went on to the villages around Caesarea Philippi. On the way, he asked them, "Who do people say I am?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others, one of the prophets." "But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" Peter answered, "You are the Messiah." Jesus warned them not to tell anyone. He then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He spoke plainly about this, and people took him aside and began to rebuke him. But when Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter. "Get behind me, Satan," he said. "You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." Then he called the crowd to him along with his disciples and said, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? If anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of them when he comes in his Father's glory with the holy angels." This is the word of the Lord.
Challenging words. And in these challenging times, we might wish for more comfortable words. When Jesus says that if we want to follow him, we must be prepared to take up our cross and deny our lives. That is the ultimate challenge, isn't it? And it goes very counter to our culture and something in our human nature sometimes. Because in the end, when it comes down to it, we're kind of like the self-preservation society, aren't we? I don't know if you remember the Italian Job from, I don't know if the remake had that thing about it, but the self-preservation society. And you know, who would be a lemming when we have our lives and the lives of our loved ones to look after? The self-preservation society. The challenge for us sometimes when things are tough is to kind of withdraw behind our defences, to put up the self-preservation force field and to shield ourselves from all of the stuff that comes. It doesn't stop the stuff coming though, does it? It doesn't stop. You cannot put up a shield against illness in yourself, your family, your loved ones. You cannot put up a shield against yourself from all that's happening in the world, against climate change and all that's happening in so many different ways. We might protect ourselves to some extent, but we are still ultimately very vulnerable. And it begs the question, how do we get through? How will we get through? And I want to suggest this morning that Jesus' call here to deny ourselves is not simply adding more danger, more jeopardy to our situation, although of course following Jesus may well expose us to greater jeopardy. But that what Jesus here is calling us to is a form of self-preservation. A form of self-preservation. It follows on these words, well, they began, we heard the words that Neil read to us, began with Jesus asking the disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And if you'd been there, eavesdropping on the conversation, you might have wondered, was Jesus maybe a little bit insecure? You know, what do people think about me? I don't think that's the case at all. Jesus seems abundantly self-aware throughout his whole ministry, in everything that he says and does, has a strong conviction and awareness of his personhood and of his purpose and his destiny. But the interesting thing about that question, who do people say that I am, is that the answer tells us perhaps not so much about who Jesus is, but about the person who's answering the question. Who do people say that I am? The answers that come tell us more about the people than they tell us about Jesus. Some say Elijah, some say one of the prophets, others John the Baptist, some just haven't got a clue. And if you answer that question, who is Jesus for you? Your answer and mine will say more about you and me than it will perhaps about Jesus. Because we will identify in Jesus the things that we perceive that we need and the things that we perceive to be what we're looking for. But Jesus then moves on, because actually, although Peter goes on and says, "You are the Messiah," Jesus knows that even that confession of who he is not enough. It's not enough for us simply to verbalize an answer and say, that's that, solved, answer given, in a box, tidied away, dealt with. Confession of itself is not enough. You can see that straight away with Peter, because as soon as Jesus then starts to explain what being the Messiah means, Peter can't have any of it. And he ends up saying, this is not going to happen to you, and Jesus telling him off. From hero to zero for Peter. From 100% to 0% score. He's got it right, he's got it so wrong. And you have to have sympathy with Peter to some extent, don't you? Because Jesus, in effect, says, you've called me the Messiah, but I'm a dead man walking. That's a phrase, isn't it? Because he's on his way to Jerusalem. He is going to go from hero to zero. And Peter will have none of it. And that's so understandable, because Peter has invested everything in following Jesus. And now Jesus is saying, but actually I'm going to die. I'm on my way to my death, and you must follow me. And before we're quick to laugh at Peter for his naivety or criticize him, then we must appreciate that we might well have said something very, very similar and struggled in the way that Peter struggled to know what Jesus was all about. You see, Jesus is fundamentally not part of the self-preservation society. He is going to Jerusalem to lay down his all, his very being, for all humanity, in self-giving, self-sacrificial love, to give everything. And that's so difficult for us to get our heads around, isn't it? Because our instinct is to preserve ourselves and to preserve those around us and to preserve life. And yet Jesus does not cling to life so tightly that he will not let it go. But instead he empties himself and gives of himself, even his very life on a cross. And the spiritual truth is that the more we cling to anything, the looser our grip on it becomes. That's ironic, isn't it? But it can be true in a relationship, of any kind of relationship. If you cling to a person so tightly, you've already lost them. if you cannot release the grip a little bit, you've already lost them. And if we cling to our lives, cling to our possessions, cling to our hopes and our dreams, then the chances are they will run like sand through our fingers and away. And when the tough times come, the temptation might be that we turn in on ourselves and preserve ourselves and put up shields and barriers to protect ourselves. It's almost an instinct that we have. But actually, life is never found in that. When we do those things, it might be a necessary survival tactic for a little while, but when we do those things, we actually diminish our lives and the lives of those around us. For true life comes in relationship with others and in service to others and in giving ourselves to and for others. And so Jesus says that if we want to save our lives, we will lose them. If we cling to our lives so desperately, life will just disappear and go. But those who lose their lives, who let their lives go into the hands of God, who lose their lives for me and for the gospel, Jesus says, will save it. If we give ourselves in the service of Jesus Christ and of his gospel and of his kingdom, ironically, the more we give ourselves, the more life we find. Because Jesus says you can gain the whole world and yet forfeit your soul. When he's talking about our souls here, do understand he's not just talking about that bit of us that carries on when we die, you know, that bit that kind of leaves the body and goes off at the moment of death. That's a kind of Greek understanding of the soul from Greek philosophy and not from biblical theology. What Jesus here is talking about is the essential you, the essential me. That's our soul, the thing that makes us what we are. We do use the word in that sense sometimes, don't we? When we talk about somebody, we'll say they've got soul, or that was soul destroying or soul feeding. It means it fed the very essence of who we are and what we are. And that's what Jesus here is talking about when he talks about the soul. He's talking about the essential you and the essential me, the thing that makes you, you, and me, the very heart of the person. And he says, you can grab everything in the world. You can achieve all the goals and the ambitions and the material objectives that the world sets before you, but none of that is worth anything compared to your essential you. You can have the whole world, but don't do it at the price of yourself. Because you, your soul, by implication, your soul is more precious than the whole world. And so you can be a Jeff Bezos or whoever, or Mark Zuckerberg or whatever, and have everything that the world desires and dreams of. But if you were to lose your soul, you would have gained nothing. And Jesus says that our souls, therefore, are the most precious thing of all. I wonder whether you value yourself as highly as Jesus does. To him rather, you are more precious than the whole world. And he will go to the cross and lay down his life because of how precious you are to him. And he calls us to emulate him, to go his way, to walk with him, and to realize that our lives, our souls are enriched not in grabbing stuff to ourselves, not in protecting ourselves, even preserving ourselves, but in giving ourselves to God and to others. May you know how precious is your soul to him. And may you walk with him, finding in his example the enrichment and the fullness of life that is his will for you. And may you actually find that as you do so, this is the ultimate in self-preservation, because your soul will be preserved by him in this life and into all eternity. So maybe after all, we are in Jesus, the self-preservation society.